All right, today we're going to talk about the legacy of the Revolutionary War, section 7.4. And we're going to start with one American story. And this is a picture of an older guy that we're going to talk about, a 15-year-old named Joseph Plum Martin of Connecticut. But back in 1776, he signed up to fight for the Americans, and he stayed with the Army until the war ended. And he rose in rank from private to sergeant, and that's what you see him here as a sergeant. Among his experiences were the terrible winter at Valley Forge and winning the battle at Yorktown. One of the hardest things Martin faced was leaving the Army after the war was over. Many years later, he wrote about that day, and he said, "There was as much sorrow as joy. We had lived together as a family of brothers for several years, setting aside some little family squabbles like most other families. We had shared with each other the hardships, dangers, and sufferings incident to a soldier's life. We had sympathized with each other in trouble and sickness, had assisted in bearing each other's burdens, and now we were to be parted forever." So at the war's end, Martin and his country faced an uncertain future. How would the United States recover from the war? What issues would confront the new nation? So today we're going to take a look at that and answer some of those questions. So for today's learning targets, by the time we're done, you should be able to evaluate the strengths of the American Army in comparison with the British Army. We'll also discuss and summarize the 1783 Treaty of Paris. You should be able to analyze the costs of the revolution, monetary and human lives. And you should be able to identify the challenges that the new United States faced after the war. So, in November of 1783, the last British ships and troops left New York City, and American troops marched in. As Washington said goodbye to his officers in a New York tavern, he hugged each one of them. Tears ran down his face, and he became so upset he had to leave the room. Earlier in the fall, Washington had written a farewell letter to his armies, and in it, he praised them by saying that their endurance, quote, "through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years, was little short of a standing miracle." And it truly was. By their persistence, the Americans won independence even though they faced many obstacles. As we've talked about, they lacked training and experience. They were often short of supplies and weapons, and by contrast, the British forces ranked among the best trained in the world. They were experienced and well-equipped professional soldiers, yet the Americans had certain advantages that enabled them to win. And here are the distinct advantages. Hint, hint, could end up on a test. First of all, they had better leadership. British generals were overconfident and made a lot of poor decisions. Remember Gentleman Johnny? By contrast, Washington learned from his mistakes. After early defeats, he developed the strategy of dragging out the war to wear down the British. Despite difficulties, he never gave up. Second one, foreign aid. Britain's rivals, especially France, helped America. Foreign loans and military aid were essential to America's victory, and without the help of France at the end with Jean Rochambeau and the French fleet, they probably would not have been able to win the battle as fast as they did. Third, knowledge of the land. The Americans knew the land where the war took place and used that knowledge very well. They were fighting in their own backyard. The British could control coastal cities but could not extend their control to the interior. And finally, motivation. The Americans had more reason to fight. At stake were not only their lives, but also their property and their dream of liberty and freedom. So as the winners, the Americans won favorable terms in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War. The treaty included the following 6 conditions. First of all, the United States would be independent. Second, boundaries for the country were to be the Mississippi River to the west, Canada to the north, and Spanish Florida to the south, with obviously the Atlantic Ocean being on the east. Third, the U.S. had the right to fish off of Canada's Atlantic coast. Fourth, each side had to repay debts it owed each other. That's really never happened. Fifth, the British had to return any enslaved persons from capture. That also never really happened completely. And sixth, Congress would recommend that the states return any property they had seized from loyalists. That also didn't happen. So Americans didn't repay the pre-war debts they owed the British merchants. They did not return loyalist property, and the British also did not return runaway slaves. They also refused to give up military outposts in the Great Lakes area, like in Fort Detroit. So, interestingly enough, this picture here was done by the American painter Benjamin West. This is a portrait of the men who negotiated the Treaty of Paris, but the British officials refused to pose, so West never finished the painting. From left to right are the American officials John Jay, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and two others as well. So I think the British were poor sports. Now, no one knows exactly how many people died in the war, but 8 years of fighting took a very terrible toll. An estimated 25,700 Americans died in the war, and 1,400 remained missing. About 8,200 Americans were wounded. Some were left with permanent disabilities such as amputated limbs. The British suffered about 10,000 military deaths. Many soldiers who survived the war left the army with no money. They had received little or no pay for their service. So instead of back pay, the government gave some soldiers certificates for the land in the West. Many men sold that land to get money for food and other basic needs. Both the Congress and the states had borrowed money to finance the conflict. The war left the nation with a debt of about $27 million, which is a debt that would prove very difficult to pay off. The losers of the war also suffered. Thousands of loyalists lost their property. Between 60,000 and 100,000 loyalists left the United States during and after the war. Among them were several thousand African Americans and Native Americans, including Joseph Brant. Most of the loyalists went to Canada, and there they settled new towns and provinces. They also brought English traditions to areas the French had settled. Even today, Canada has both French and English as official languages. Now, the American Revolution was not just a war, but it was also a change in ideas about government. Before the war, Americans had demanded their rights as English citizens. But after declaring their independence, they replaced that goal with the idea of republicanism. This idea states that instead of a king, the people would rule. The government would obtain its authority from the citizens and be responsible to them. For the system to work, individuals would have to place the good of the country above their own interests. At first, only men were allowed to take part in governing by voting or holding public office, and not even all men. However, women could help the nation by teaching their children the virtues that benefited public life. Those virtues included honesty, duty, and the willingness to make sacrifice. As part of their liberty, Americans called for more religious freedom. Before the war, some laws discriminated against certain religions. Some states had not allowed Jews or Catholics to hold public office. After the war, states began to abolish those laws. They also ended the practice of using tax money to support churches. Many people began to see a conflict between slavery and the ideal of liberty. Vermont outlawed slavery, and Pennsylvania passed a law to free slaves gradually. Individual African Americans also tried to end slavery. For example, this lady here, Elizabeth Freeman, sued for her freedom in a Massachusetts court, and she won. Her victory in 1781 and other similar cases ended slavery in all of Massachusetts. Freeman later described her desire for freedom by saying, "Any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me and I had been told that I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it, just to stand 1 minute on God's earth a free woman." With freedom, African Americans began to form their own institutions. For example, the preacher Richard Allen helped start the Free African Society. That society encouraged African Americans to help each other. Allen also founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first African American church in the United States. Perhaps the main issue facing Americans after the war was how to shape their national government. American anger over British taxes, violation of rights, and control of trade had caused the war. Now the United States needed a government that would protect citizens' rights and economic freedom. So that is what we're going to take a look at in Chapter 8.